from being the emperor's personal bodyguard to being the emperor's personal army. Refusing to forget about the regular soldiers who would not be chosen to serve in the expanded Praetorians, Severus then nearly doubled the annual pay of all the men left out on the frontiers. In this, Severus found himself once again paralleling Domitian, who, you'll recall, used a similar wage increase to guarantee that an officer's call to revolt would always fall on deaf ears. The long-term effects of the raise, though, would be to further cleave the interests of civilian and soldier, as it became more and more of a burden for the former to pay what the latter expected. And not only were the troops being paid more, but by the end of Severus's reign, there were more of them to pay. Before his death, Severus had ballooned the active service up to 33 full legions, with increases in local auxiliaries to match. Rome had not seen this many active duty soldiers since the days of Octavian and Antony, and they all swore their allegiance to Severus and Severus alone. Well, not only Severus, also his sons Caracalla and Geta, and also the man Severus put in charge of his newly reformed Praetorian Guard, Gaius Fulvius Plautianus. For a while, they swore allegiance to him too, a development that everyone in the Severan inner circle came to view with alarm. Everyone except the emperor, that is. Plautianus was Severus's maternal cousin, and the two men had been close friends for years. When Albinus was vanquished, Severus finally had a free hand to conduct the affairs of state his way, and one of his first unfettered acts was to appoint Plautianus Praetorian Prefect in 197. This promotion effectively elevated Plautianus to the position of Severus's second-in-command. Caracalla and Geta, while officially Severus's heirs, were still only 9 and 8 respectively, and in no way ready for official responsibility, so it fell to Plautianus to help Severus run the show, and from the get-go, his influence was felt. In contrast to the period following the defeat of Niger, where Severus took great pains to avoid executing the Syrian governor's supporters in the Senate, he was convinced to follow up his final victory over Albinus with a spate of political executions. With Plautianus' help, Severus drew up a list of friends, non-entities, and enemies, with the aim of promoting the first, ignoring the second, and liquidating the last. Though they did spare many, Severus and Plautianus executed some 20 to 30 members of the Senate who had openly supported the governor of Britannia. Thrown onto this list for good measure was also Pertinax's father-in-law Sulpicianus, the only man left alive in the empire who had ever publicly aimed at becoming emperor. We can't have that lying around now, can we? The purge whetted Plautianus' appetite as he personally took control of the estates of all the dead senators. Suddenly, he had power and wealth beyond his wildest dreams, and naturally, he wanted more. Over the next few years, the governing relationship between Severus and Plautianus grew to reflect the former's disdain for the tedium of imperial governance and the latter's insatiable lust for more and more power. Severus began to defer to his prefect on practically any matter of domestic importance, and Plautianus was only too happy to take responsibility for the everyday maintenance of the empire. From it, Plautianus became the de facto dictator of Rome. If you wanted something done, you had to go through Plautianus, and if you ran afoul of the prefect, there was no appeal. Severus, in his own words, loved and trusted the man more than any other in the empire. Plautianus exploited this trust to the hilt, settling personal scores, confiscating whatever property he took a fancy to, and generally using the imperial bureaucracy as a means of personal enrichment. With Plautianus captaining the ship of state for him, Severus was free to indulge in pastimes that interested him far more than running the government, namely, war and conquest. So far, apart from his brief campaign in Parthia, all Severus's great victories as emperor had come against his fellow Romans, a legacy no general was eager to leave behind. So Severus decided he needed to do something to bolster his historical credibility. Having already achieved a string of easy victories in the east following his triumph over Niger, the emperor decided that Parthia would once again be a great place to pad his resume. His official casus belli for war came in 198, after the Parthians moved some forces to their western frontier as a delayed response to his previous invasion of their territory in 195. Citing the threat to Roman interests, the emperor headed to Syria to oversee an offensive into Mesopotamia. As was Severus' style, actual leadership of the initial campaign was handed over to a highly capable subordinate, in this case, a general named Letus. And in case you're wondering, the answer is no. I don't know if this Letus was related to the conniving Praetorian prefect so recently executed by Severus. This Letus had served Severus throughout the civil wars, and is credited in some histories with being the man who turned the tide at the Battle of Lugdunum, after Severus had been swept up in the nearly disastrous retreat of his left wing. He had been posted in the east following the battle, and in the intervening year had been skirmishing with the Parthians in and around the Euphrates River. When Severus arrived, Letus was more than ready to be let off his leash, and a fleet was ordered built to ferry the Syrian legions down the Euphrates River. Following the footsteps of Trajan and Avidius Cassius, the Romans sailed down the Euphrates, sacking Babylon, Seleucia, and Ctesiphon along the way. As usual, the Parthians were no match for the sudden Roman invasion, and, as before, the victories came easy. The next year, Letus and Severus led the legions across the river into the heart of Mesopotamia. They met little resistance until they came to the strategically important city of Hatra. Unlike the more westernly Parthian cities, which were often quickly abandoned by the Parthian king and then reoccupied later when the coast was clear, Hatra was actually, militarily speaking, a key Parthian asset. Centrally located, it served as a launching pad to points all throughout Old Persia. Losing Ctesiphon, even if it was technically the capital, was one thing. Losing Hatra was quite another, and as a result, the Romans met obstinate resistance to their siege. The legions were forced to retire before the arrival of winter, having little to show for their efforts but dead bodies and destroyed equipment. Over the winter, there was a shake-up in the high command, as Severus grew increasingly paranoid about Letus, who was brilliant, charismatic, and beloved by the troops. It was rumored that his legions would not march unless Letus gave the signal, a rumor that, whatever its validity, really rubbed Severus the wrong way. And when you rub a Roman emperor the wrong way, the consequences are often dire. Along with another officer thrown in for some minor slight, Letus was accused of some imagined crime or another, seized by imperial agents, and executed by Severus in late 199. With his able commander gone, the next year, Severus personally led the legions back across Mesopotamia to Hatra, planning to sack the city or die trying. In the end, he did neither. Hatra once again held out against the Roman attack. After most of his siege engines were destroyed and most of his men lay dead or wounded, Severus withdrew back across the Euphrates with the winter of 200 approaching. Weary of banging his head against the walls of Hatra, Severus did what any good leader would do. He declared victory and left. Severus celebrated this, victory by erecting the now famous Arch of Septimius Severus in 202, famous in part because it's still standing in Rome, depicting his triumphs in the east and generally glorifying the Severan family. The arch is indeed impressive, and architecturally, it stands up well to the Arch of Titus and the columns of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, but the underlying campaign itself doesn't hold a candle to the victories of his predecessors. The Arch of Severus is a glorious mountain, erected atop an inglorious molehill. While Severus was off playing the part of conqueror, Plautianus was back in Rome playing the part of emperor. He considered himself well above the law, confiscating whatever he liked, exiling or killing whatever he didn't. Pretty soon, even Severus's allies began to grow concerned about the unchecked hubris of good Plautianus. But throughout this period, any attempt to convince the emperor that his prefect was turning into something of a monster was met with a dismissive hand. The basic problem was that Severus trusted Plautianus more than any of the men who denounced him, so he always believed the prefect side of any story. But despite his best efforts to remain in denial, it seems that eventually the steady drip of complaints began to have their effect on the mind of the emperor, and when he returned from the east, he began to notice things that reinforced his nascent suspicions. When coins were minted, Plautianus now included himself on the list of acceptable likenesses. When the Praetorians took their oath of fidelity, a promise of personal loyalty to Plautianus had been inserted into the ceremony. When statues of the imperial family were commissioned, Plautianus fell, and sometimes he went so far as to order that his be made slightly larger than those of Severus and his sons. All of these little pieces began to fit together in Severus's head, and a picture started to emerge that looked an awful lot like the man his other advisors had been warning him about for years. Cassius Dio finally tells a brief story of a highly embarrassing moment for the emperor, when Severus ordered a bailiff to call a particular case to trial, but the bailiff, the practical man that he was, that is, he took seriously his own self-preservation, replied that he wasn't going to bring any case to trial without Plautianus's permission. The parallel to Letus's men maybe refusing to march without their general's okay was obvious, and while Severus no doubt played the incident off well, the question now hung out there in the open. Who was really in charge around here? But still, the emperor persisted in his denial through 202, when he married Caracalla to Plautianus's daughter Plotina, and through 203, when he made Plautianus consul. But in late 204, the wheels finally came off the bus. Because the thing is, while Severus loved and trusted Plautianus, the rest of the Severan family hated his guts. Severus's wife Julia Domna and Plautianus despised each other, and each took every private opportunity offered to disparage the other to the emperor. Caracalla, meanwhile, suspected Plautianus of plotting to undermine his rightful inheritance, and took his rage out on Plotina, who he hated by extension. Only 14 at the time of the marriage, Caracalla was already showing his sociopathic tendencies, and made it quite clear that when his father died, and he became sole emperor, that he was going to kill his new wife and father-in-law as his first order of business. Now it seems possible, even probable, that Plautianus was indeed looking to ace Caracalla out of his inheritance. But if Caracalla was looking to guarantee that Plautianus was looking to ace him out of his inheritance, well, violent death threats are just about the way to go. So I think it's safe to say that whatever Plautianus's intentions had been, he was now definitely plotting to keep Caracalla off the throne. After all, his life depended on it. Rumors then reached Caracalla of Plautianus's intensified scheming, and the young prince took it as confirmation that he had been right all along, and decided that he needed to act sooner rather than later to deal with the troublesome prefect. What he settled on was a frame-up job that was so comically transparent, it is shocking that Severus even believed it. Doubly shocking, in that whatever doubts had been growing quietly in his mind, Severus had for years proven himself to be constitutionally incapable of distrusting Plautianus. Why did Severus decide that now was finally the time to give up on his once-beloved colleague? The answer seems to lie in a conversation between the emperor and his brother, Publius Septimius Geta, while Publius